In this video, I'll be ranking every single usable Pokemon in Platinum before the post-game. I will be judging each Pokemon based on how well they perform from the moment you get them, all the way up to and including the Pokemon League. And this includes the entire line, not just final evolutions. As always, I will be coming at this list with a hardcore Nuzlocking background, but most of what I say should apply to casual playthroughs as well, unless I say otherwise. And unlike my tier list of Emerald, I will try to actually rank every single Pokemon within each tier, so that way it's a lot easier to see who ranks where. To quickly go over the tiers, S is for the best, Pokemon that either possess something game-breaking or have very favorable matchups against some of the tougher obstacles in the game. A is for the very good, Pokemon that you can basically never go wrong with ever. They're just a bit more balanced than your S tier encounters. B is for the solid, balanced and well designed for the Sinnoh region. Might have some flaws here and there, but overall you're not disappointed with anything in this tier either. C is for the average. Totally usable Pokemon, but you'll have to be significantly more selective with how you use them throughout your journey. D is for the underperforming, Pokemon that can still be useful in a small handful of situations, but they have a lot more cons than pros. And F is for the useless or basically useless. Every Pokemon can technically be useful in some capacity, but there are a few encounters you will never want to use unless you are forcing yourself to do so. And I don't have a banned category here, but you can safely assume that all legendaries or Pokemon that aren't usable until the post game are not going to be rated here. To wrap things up, this is all of course just my personal opinion. There may be some things that I get wrong, but I am very eager to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. Grab yourself a snack and strap in. Let's get into the list. As all tier lists must go, we begin with the starters, and I'll be spending a little extra time on these guys since they are guaranteed and you'll have them for the entirety of your playthrough. I've got Infernape in the Chimchar line as a very high S, the Turtwig line as a high A, and Piplup and company at a lower A. We're starting off hot with these guys. Starting with Torterra, I cannot emphasize enough how beginner friendly this line truly is. The Turtwig line is incredibly easy to use for the first half of your adventure, and it honestly may be the best out of these three starters for that section of the game. You'll enjoy the excellent offensive matchups against Rourke, Fantina, and Maylene. Grass is obviously great against Rock, Grottle will have Bite for Fantina, and Maylene's level cap is 32, which just so happens to not only be the level in which you'll receive your Torterra, but also when you'll learn Earthquake via level up, which as it turns out is just as insanely broken in practice as it seems on paper. And you'll still be plenty tanky enough to help out against the Mars and Jupiter fights as well. And while the Turtwig line is especially powerful in the early to mid game, Torterra definitely still holds its own going into the late game as well, especially when obtaining your 8th gym badge and taking on Route 223 and Victory Road. The biggest reason I can't put Torterra into S is because of its poor speed stat and the 4x weakness to ice, which is a type that will definitely become more common as the playthrough progresses. And despite the additional weaknesses to flying and fire, I still think Torterra deserves a spot this high on the list for what it will do for you in the first half of your playthrough alone. Now moving on to the least beginner friendly starter in Sinnoh, and that will of course be Infernape and the rest of the Chimchar line. This line is much less beginner friendly due to their highly offensive stat spread. You don't just get to be super fast and powerful without some sort of drawback, and for these guys, that would be defenses. With that being said, part of the reason Infernape is in S tier is because it is super fast and powerful. Chimchar and Monferno will perform just fine against the first 4 gyms. You will get Monferno at level 14, which is just in time for Rourke. You'll obviously crush Gardenia into Ash, and you'll be fairly useful against both Mars and Jupiter as well, particularly with Mars and that Perugly. You will start to see some struggles here and there with Fantina and Maylene, as by that point in the game, Monferno becomes a little too squishy for my liking. It can just be hard to not lose him if you're not picking your battles carefully. But once you get that Infernape, it's curtains, man. Upon evolving, it would not be uncommon for your Fire Monkey's learn set to be Mach Punch, Close Combat, Flamethrower, and then take your pick between Shadow Claw, Earthquake, or Aerial Ace. You'll obviously have a tough time against Crasher Nature Wake, although I think it may be possible to learn Thunder Punch though at the move tutor right outside of Pastoria, and if that's the case, you can easily take out Gyarados and even Floatzel as well. But what really launches Infernape onto the Platinum Throne are the obstacles the game throws at you during the second half of your adventure. Your Fire Monkey from Hell will check Candace's entire team, as well as Cyrus's most dangerous threat in Weavile. Two of the most difficult obstacles in the entire run are turned into child's play, and that's why Infernape has solidified its top tier placement on my tier list. And last but certainly not least, we have my favorite starter in Sinnoh in Empoleon. Starting with the good, the Water Steel combo is not only a sick typing thematically, it's the biggest reason why I love this line so much, but just may be one of the best defensive typings in the whole generation. Your Empoleon can safely switch into almost anything, and that makes it for a very reliable team member. Bulky water types are already useful, throwing Steel into the mix just makes it even better. Other than Volcaner, you're really not going to have any bad matchups either for the rest of the run. You won't hard counter anything either necessarily, other than maybe Byron, but I mean half the regional decks can hard counter Byron, but you'll always be generally formidable against most random trainers and boss fights alike. And of course, the traditional Surf/Ice Beam combo will always serve you well, regardless of what you run up against. Now let's go over why I'm placing this line towards the lower end of A, and why I believe it is the worst pick out of these three starters. Now if you noticed, I have not even mentioned Piplup or Printplup until just now, and that is because those two are the biggest thing bringing this line down. Sure, you'll match up great against Rourke, but after that, you will be dragging Printplup through the next several boss fights. Matchup wise, you'll be just okay against Mars and Jupiter, but worse off when compared to Grottle and Monferno. Printplup is useless against Gardenia, bad against Fantina, and there aren't any advantages against Maylene either. Not only that, but Printplup's level up moveset is quite bad. Luckily in Platinum you do get Bubble Beam at level 19 now, which is definitely a significant improvement over where it was in Diamond and Pearl, but you still have to deal with Bubble, Peck, and Metal Claw until then. It doesn't feel great. The line is also generally pretty slow, and just like in most Pokemon games, there are a ton of other water types to choose from, so Piplup's value does decrease a little bit from that as well. Make no mistake though, the line may take a bit of time to get going, but Empoleon is still easily one of the best water types you can obtain in Sinnoh. Alright, 3 down and a whole lot more to go. Staraptor is fantastic and is going into the A tier for sure. It's fast, it hits hard, it has 2 immunities, and it will always have Intimidate, which is probably the best overall ability in all of Nuzlocking. What puts it even further over the top when you compare to the other basic flying types is the fact that you get close combat upon evolving, which is coverage that you'll pretty much never see on any other Pokemon with a similar typing. It is worth noting that both Starly and Staravia are quite frail, especially Starly, so you just have to be careful with how you utilize the line up until you can safely obtain your Staraptor. But still, Starly even gets Wing Attack at like level 9 I think, which is just silly, and Staravia will be very helpful against Mars and Jupiter with Intimidate. It'll also tear Gardenia into pieces, and it can even be used as a decent pivot in the fight against Fantina as well. And there are plenty of other situations in which this line can shine. You can pretty much never go wrong with them. Next, we have our favorite Goofy Boy, and if you have been following my How Good Is This Pokemon series, you already know where this is going. It is very unfortunate that I have to place Bibarel in this tier, but the evidence is just too overwhelming. Most early game normal type encounters from any game are typically designed in a way to have a very nice early game advantage. A nice little power spike that will last for perhaps the first half of your run before they start to fall off a bit. However, it would appear that Game Freak forgot to bestow such tools upon this line. Starting with the Learn set, it sucks. Your first serviceable physical attack won't come until Headbutt at level 18, which sounds like it would be quote-unquote early, but when you realize that similar Pokemon such as Zigzagoon get it at level 9, it's kinda late. You also don't get Yawn until level 28, which is basically right around the point in the game where a Pokemon like Bibarel will start to drop off quite a lot. Both of its abilities are great, at least, except, again, Bibarel can't really utilize either of them well due to its poor Learn set options. And of course we have the matchups, which paints the saddest picture of them all. If you're playing with hardcore rules, you will not have Bibarel for Rourke, which means you will not have Water Gun. Your newly acquired Water typing will then render you useless against Gardenia, and you'll be fairly weak against Fantina's Magical Leaf as well from Mismagius. And then of course you've got Maylene and her fighting types, and well, we all get the issue there. But hey, it is the best HM slave in the game, and that should count for something at least. Bibarel is definitely on the higher end of this tier, but it's still clear to me that this line is just going to underperform in most situations. I'm going to put Kricketune on the highest end of D tier for the time being, but I honestly think I could be convinced to put it into C tier. Let me know what you think in the comments. What makes Kricketune better than Bibarel for me is simply the matchups within the first half of your run. You'll do very well against Gardenia, and you can at least resist Maylene's fighting type attacks. You can also delay Kricketot's evolution until level 16 to pick up Bug Bite, which will allow you to steal and eat berries from enemies. You can pick up Silver Powder very early as well to boost that damage a bit. It is a shame they pushed X-Scissor back to level 30 in Platinum, whereas I think it was obtainable at level 26 in Diamond and Pearl if I'm not mistaken. So that is unfortunate. So yeah, overall Kricketune definitely has more flaws than upside, but like I said, I could be convinced to put it into C, especially if you selected Piplup as your starter and need some help against Gardenia. And now moving on to our first B tier Pokemon in Luxray. This line would easily be an A tier Pokemon if it had better move pool options. The only options you have to maximize the line's powerful physical attack are Spark, Bite, and Crunch really? And Iron Tail, I guess? I suppose you also do get the Elemental Fangs as well, which is pretty cool, but still, if your entire moveset is filled with 65 base power attacks, it's just fun to think about what could have been. Luxray's special attack stat isn't bad though, at least, so you can still utilize Thunderbolt as well, and if you do get Intimidate as your ability, then you can probably consider your Shinx to be an A tier encounter. If you get Rivalry on the other hand, you are a lot less excited about that. It's not terrible, but it just makes everything so much more annoying and inconsistent and awkward. Like, you'll be even better in some fights depending on your gender, but also so much less usable in other fights to the point where you'll have to actually consider benching your Luxray in some situations, which never feels good, obviously. I'm also not positive if Rivalry boosts / reduces all damage or just physical damage in this generation. If it only affects one or the other, then that also makes things even more confusing. I still think this line is at least solid though, regardless of ability, as having at least one electric type on the team is always nice, particularly against all of the flying type threats such as your rival Staraptor, Cynthia's Togekiss and Milotic, and like half of Cyrus's team too. Kadabra and Alakazam are super easy to rank in most games. They'll be going into the B and A tiers respectively. They're both extremely fast and hit very hard. It is unfortunate that you cannot obtain the TM for Energy Ball before the post game, because that would have been a really nice coverage option that this line doesn't normally receive. You do get Focus Blast though if you want it, which is cool but very risky. It's important to mention that this line is a little bit weaker in these games specifically for two reasons. One, there are a lot more physical threats, and two, the introduction to the physical special split. All of those dark type moves that Kadabra and Alakazam used to be able to take in the past are now physical. Moves like Bite, Crunch, Pursuit, and even Payback are now extremely deadly. With that being said, you still get Kadabra at level 16, and it will still put in great work against Gardenia and Maylene early, and then Alakazam will match up fairly neutrally against the rest of the game. It doesn't necessarily counter anything major necessarily, its stats are just super high and very reliable. Moving on to Roserade, I'm conflicted where to place it. It obviously has very formidable stats, abilities are fine, and you do get some powerful stab options in Giga Drain and Sludge Bomb. You can also get Shadow Ball and even Weather Ball if you wanted to get a Sun team going. Grass is just one of the weakest types in Sinnoh. It's actually good that Roserade has that secondary poison typing though. I do think it helps the line survive in more situations. You will have Roselia from basically the beginning of the game thanks to it being a friendship evolution, and you'll find great success with it against Rourke and Mars for sure. But at the same time, you're also stuck with Roselia until Iron Island, so you won't have Roserade for Wake. You can still do okay in that fight with Roselia, it's just really hard to sweep without that extra bulk you get from Roserade. And it's a very mixed bag outside of all of that. This line will struggle against your rival, Cyrus, and pretty much all of Team Galactic for that matter. Most of the Pokemon League, and even someone like Volkner will be carrying Fire and Ice type coverage options, and their physical attacks as well, which doesn't work out out too well in your favor. I'm going to keep it here in B for now, but definitely on the higher end of this tier simply for the stats. Crobat is a tried and true classic that will always be helpful regardless of what version or even what generation you are playing for that matter. It's easily one of the best flyers in the game. It has massive stats, pretty good typing, and it's obviously extremely fast. And I would easily put it over Staraptor if for nothing else than the simple fact that this thing can actually take hits. You also get it a lot earlier than Staraptor at level 23 if you put in those friendship steps. And speaking of early, this line can carry your entire team for quite a while between the early and mid game. Now, there are two primary reasons why I'm keeping one of my favorite Pokemon of all time out of the S tier for this list. One, the offensive kit is pretty lackluster. You'll have great options early with Bite and Wing Attack or Pluck, but that's pretty much what you're rolling with for quite a long time. You can eventually pick up stuff like X-Scissor and Poison Jab if you want them, they just don't feel as good at the point of the game in which you obtain them. The other reason why I can't put Crobat in S is because it doesn't have very many great matchups outside of Gardenia and Maylene. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't have very many bad matchups either, but that's just it. While it will be difficult to find a matchup in which Crobat can't participate in at all, there aren't many in which Crobat is excellent in. It just doesn't hard counter anything important, at least in my opinion. I know we've all memed on Zubat at some point in our lives for how annoying it is to run into a million of them in every single cave system, but you should never be disappointed to pick one up for your Nuzlocke. Graveler and Golem I think are very similar to Kadabra and Alakazam as far as placement on this list, but for completely different reasons. Kadabra and Alakazam are just generally useful against most of the region by simply being fast and hitting hard, and Psychic is just a nice offensive type. Graveler and Golem earn their placements more so because of their specific matchups. Geodude is so strong in the early game and will make both Mars and Jupiter a lot more easy to traverse. There's also just a lot less water in Sinnoh as well compared to the other games, so you also get a lot more opportunities to use these guys in the overworld as well. Once you reach the mid game though, Graveler and Golem will ping pong their way through the rest of the game in a way. You can't use them against Crash or Wake, but they'll be just fine for Byron. You can't use them well against Candace, but then they're great against Cyrus and Volkner. You definitely can't use them on Route 223 at all, but they can definitely put in some work on those tough Victory Road trainers. And then finally against the League, you can still get great use out of them for Aaron, Flint, and a couple of Cynthia's Pokemon as well. These guys are rock solid. And yes, I was 1000% obligated to make that awful joke, and no, I will not be taking that back or apologizing. Onix is going straight to D tier. I would much rather have either Kricketune or Bibarel for sure, and the only reason I can't put it in F is because it's great against Mars and Jupiter. But that's literally it, and I cannot think of any other redeeming qualities it might have. Steelix, on the other hand, while definitely much better, I can't put it higher than a B. And honestly, I don't think it's that much better than Graveler. The weakness to fire feels really bad for some reason. I can't really explain it. I just know that when I used a Steelix during my preparation run for the walkthrough, it always felt like it underperformed. Which is weird, because it gets some cool stuff like the Elemental Fangs and Aqua Tail as well via Move Tutor. I definitely can't put it lower than B though, just for the stats alone obviously. But I feel like I'd rather have the extra attack that Golem provides, as well as the resistance to fire. It's weird, this feels wrong, but I can't deny what my personal experience has dictated. Let me know in the comments how you think I can utilize this thing to its fullest potential, because I would really like to try to use them again. Next up, we've got the fossils, and I'll just handle them together. Both of them have pretty silly stat spreads obviously, with one being far more offensive and the other more defensive. I do think Bastiodon gets an edge over Rampardos for me personally, but I am also more biased towards defensive Pokemon, especially in a Nuzlocke setting. Cranidos and Rampardos are just so vulnerable and risky to use. They are squishy and slow, which is not usually a recipe for success in Pokemon. However, if you do manage to get an attack off with it, it will probably take out the opposing Pokemon in one shot most of the time. And for that, I will put Rampardos into B. Although, I honestly do believe it's easier to use Kadabra most of the time, and so, yeah, I think it's pretty on par with Graveler. Bastiodon can also go into B, just a little bit higher. I'm going to give it a very slight edge over Steelix just for consistency. You do have to play around fighting and ground type attacks, which can sometimes be tricky, but outside of that, Bastiodon is durable in more situations. For matchups, both of these guys are going to deliver pretty similar results to the Geodude and Onix lines. Another Kanto Trade Evolution line, another B and A placement respectively. Although, I will give Machoke a pretty significant edge over Kadabra and Graveler. Actually, I think I want to put it over these steel types in this tier as well. Fighting is just a really great type overall. Your only weaknesses are against Flying and Psychic really isn't all that common until much later in the game. They learn every fighting type move known to man, they get the elemental punches, Earthquake, etc. They get Guts, which is fantastic, and what really separates them from all of the other physically bulky Pokemon that also have very high attack is they also have great special bulk as well. Machoke and Machamp are just really tanky. To quickly go over some of the key matchups this line will perform well against, you'll do well against Rourke and Mars in the early game, you'll find some great success against Maylene and Byron in the mid game, and then in the later stages of your playthrough, there's a few of Cyrus's Pokemon and Candace as well. Unfortunately, there's not much to say from the Elite Four side of things, but just being useful enough to get you there is still something that shouldn't be overlooked. These two are great. Golduck is as average as it comes. I will literally always put this thing smack dab in the middle of any tier list I ever make. If you run out of other, much better water type options, then Golduck will serve you well. It's fine. It's pretty bulky, it gets Surf and Ice Beam just like any other water type would, and that's pretty much it. Moving right along. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I do not have a whole lot of experience in general with Honey Tree encounters, so I'm not super familiar with the Wormadams. I think I can still speculate enough based on what I can see on the surface though. Starting with the plant version, I'd imagine this has to be the worst one of the three for sure. It's got one of, if not the worst type combination you can possibly have, both offensively and defensively. You can probably use it to some success against Gardenia, but that's probably where it'll end. And Wormadam doesn't have the stats like Bastiodon has to make up for its 2-4 times weaknesses. And honestly, the Sand version doesn't impress me either. It's got way less weaknesses, but its move pool options are pretty awful for its stat spread. You will find more success with Bug Bite now that you can hit it a little bit harder from the physical side, but outside of that, you're kinda stuck with a bunch of special moves. You can mitigate this problem a little bit with the TM for Dig, I suppose. Let's be honest, you're not going to waste your Earthquake TM on it. Yeah, I don't like this at all. I think it's more useful than anything else in this tier. It's another borderline pick, I suppose, and it's more useful against Jupiter and Maylene for sure, which is something. But I think you'll struggle to use this a lot in your second half of your playthrough. And finally, we have the Trash version, which is ironically the best out of the three, but it's still only goes into the C tier, I think. Bug Steel is one of the best defensive typings you can ask for. You can resist most types, you have an immunity, and your only weakness is fire. The stat spread also just makes a lot of sense for this typing. This kind of reminds me of like a budget fortress maybe. The Trash version of Wormadam is particularly nice to have as a pivot or just something that you can switch into if you're in trouble while traversing the overworld. It just doesn't do anything super well besides taking hits, with like a much lower stat spread than the other defensive Pokemon. Now, if you are stuck with a male Burmy, you will get a Mothim, and it's not great. It's not the worst thing though, if I'm being honest. I think it has more potential than people might give it credit for. It is a mixed attacker with a pretty good learn set, honestly. The biggest issues though are its speed and its typing. Bug Flying is just not good. Rock type moves are all over the place, and if this thing gets hit by anything, it's basically dead. I think if you invested heavily into speed though, you could actually put in some work with this thing. But just to be perfectly clear though, this is going to end up at the very bottom of C, most likely. Next up, we've got another bug flying combination in Beautifly, and I think it's a little worse than Mothim. Mothim has a lot more options early and overall as well. You can definitely still utilize Beautifly for Gardenia, but after that, there's not much else to really talk about. Not as good in this generation, unfortunately. And with Beautifly's counterpart here, I'm going to give Dustox C tier because it actually can be used outside of Gardenia. It's tanky for an early bug type, it gets toxic via level up, Moonlight, Protect, it's great for those things. Oh, and Light Screen as well, which is definitely helpful. And Shield Dust is a pretty awesome ability. Definitely better than Swarm on this type of Pokemon. More flying bugs incoming with Vespiquen and the infamous male Combee. If Unknown didn't exist, male Combee would be the worst possible encounter you could receive. You should never use this. Ever. Unless you are down to your last 6 Pokemon and one of them happens to be your male Combee, and even then, I would still use it as a strategic sacrifice. Vespiquen's not too bad though. It still has that horrendous typing to worry about, but it is a fairly early evolution at level 21. You get Power Gem, Toxic, Confuse Ray, and the gimmicky Order moves. Defend, Heal, and Attack order are interesting, but I think in practice, they're just not gonna click the way that you think they will. There are just so many things that can hit you for super effective damage, so it's hard to find a good spot to make that setup work. I think this is just an average Pokemon overall, maybe the higher end of C, just because I do think it is a well-designed Pokemon and definitely could be utilized. I just think you'll have to do a lot to make it work. And even when it does work, it's still going to be worse than a lot of the other options we already talked about. Alright, I gotta try to speed things up a little bit, trying to keep this under an hour, but we'll see what's possible. Pachirisu is really, really bad. It's the opposite of what I just said about Vespiquen. It is a very poorly designed Pokemon in my opinion. Its stats are built like a speedy, tanky, utility-based Pokemon, except the only utility it gets is Charm and Sweet Kiss. Pachirisu sucks. I'm sorry, don't use it if you can. Floatzel, on the other hand, does not suck. Buizel is pretty bad though, so you will have to wait until it evolves to really start using this line, but it's worth it. You'll get Floatzel at level 26, which just happens to be Fantina's level cap, and you just also happen to get Crunch as well upon evolving. Slap a Dread Plate that you got from the old Chateau on this thing, and you will very comfortably sweep one of the more difficult challenges in Sinnoh. You could also use it to deal with any flying type threats with Ice Beam or Ice Fang. You can potentially answer Cynthia's Garchomp with some EV investments, and pretty good on Cyrus too. You just have to be careful with how you utilize them. Floatzel is pretty much made of paper. Very easy to lose him to a random trainer. So Cherim's design is actually really cool, and I really do want it to be a good Pokemon, but I think the gimmick just doesn't play out super well in a lot of scenarios. Its move pool selection is so bare bones. Like, all you're really going to do is Sunny Day and then Leech Seed and then, I don't know, Petal Dance, I guess. It does help that weather effects in this generation do last forever, so if you do want to utilize Flower Gift to its fullest, this is probably one of the better generations to try it out in. Gastrodon is up next, and I'm only rating the blue and green version because I enjoy that one more. I think it's the Eastern version, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, Gastrodon is a great encounter, but I don't think I can give it the full A tier nod. It's close, but I just can't get past the speed. The typing is obviously great defensively, with only having a single weakness in Grass, but I just think it takes too many hits for it to be out as long as it needs to be. You will eventually get Recover at 54, I believe, which would be in time for the Pokemon League, and I do think this becomes an A tier Pokemon once you do get to that point. But before then, it's just solid. Shellos kinda sucks though, even though it gets Water Pulse as its starting move. So if you can help it, I would recommend getting this as your encounter later on in the run. Like Route 218 would be a good spot, just in time for Iron Island and Byron. Heracross is absolutely insane if you get crazy lucky with your Honey Tree encounter. Easy S tier, everything about it is amazing apart from the 4x weakness to flying, but you're decently fast, decently bulky, and you hit really freaking hard with a variety of moves. Night Slash, Close Combat, Aerial Ace, Earthquake, there's some rock type coverage options in there as well. It's wonderful. Great against pretty much everything other than those pesky birds. I, like most of you, hate Ambipom's design, and I'm not really sure how to feel about its performance in battle either. Like most normal types, it gets all of the coverage under the sun, but can't really utilize it well due to its lackluster special attack stat. And speaking of special attack, this thing does get Baton Pass, but it can only be used with either Agility or Nasty Plot. For those of you who don't know, Nasty Plot increases your special attack. But the other problem we have here is that Ambipom is just too frail for this setup to even work. You won't have enough time to use stuff like Sand Attack, Tickle, and Screech either. Those tools just feel like they're wasted on a Pokemon that can't hold its own for very long. The only appeal that I see in this poor monkey is the combination of Technician and Fury Swipes / double hit, I guess? What am I saying? That doesn't sound that good at all, actually. I do think I would rather have Dustox if I'm being completely honest, so I'll put him right here. Drifblim is going to go right next to Golduck as just another solid, middle-of-the-road option. I wish this Pokemon was better, because I really love the type combination, but it ended up being a little more underwhelming for me in my playthrough when I used it. I even got Unburden on it as well, but it never actually really utilized it well, and I never found many situations which I could have used it. Drifloon is pretty bad on its own outside of using it on Gardenia for a little bit, but it won't evolve until after Fantina's level cap of 28, so you can't use it there either. It does get Thunderbolt and Psychic for some good coverage, which is good against Wake, for example, and it has a passable attack stat, so you could use the balloon to get around Sinnoh with Fly as well. Again, I wish it was better, but it's still fine. Lopunny is another weird normal type, but it's definitely better than Ambipom at least. You get it super early as a friendship evolution, and stab returns will hit for a lot right out of the gate. You'll have access to all of the elemental punches as well, it's fast, it doesn't really have any weaknesses obviously, and yeah, it's just the definition of solid. It's kind of like Crobat in a sense that it doesn't hard counter any major obstacles necessarily, it's just generally decent against a lot of stuff. And now, things get a little more interesting, as we've got our final line of Kanto trait evolutions in Haunter and Gengar. Now, I may be a little biased here, but unlike the trend we've seen with the other trait evolutions on the tier list so far, these two will not be going into B and A respectively. And in fact, I believe the discrepancy in power between these two is far greater than what we've seen with the others. Haunter is going into C, and my boy is going straight to S. Haunter is unfortunately done super dirty in the Generation 4 games. Imagine for just a second if Kadabra also had a poor special defense stat, evolved 9 levels later, and started out only learning physical attacks. Yeah. That's Haunter in Gen 4. Upon evolving, your only damaging attacks will be Sucker Punch and Shadow Punch, two very good moves on paper, just not for a Pokemon built like Haunter. You will eventually pick up the same stuff that you can give to your Gengar, at which point you'll be in a very similar position to Kadabra. It just takes so much longer to get there, and that's why Haunter will sit in the C tier. Now let me try to justify my S tier placement for Gengar. Yes, Ghastly is pretty awful, and yes, I just spent the last minute going over Haunter's C tier status. However, even though on emulators you'll have to wait until 37 to get your Gengar, which is Crasher Wake's level cap by the way, it will utterly terrorize the rest of Sinnoh from that point forward. I don't think it's as good as the others in this tier or anything, but man, once you get this thing rolling with Shadow Ball, Thunderbolt, Psychic, and then you can pick up those choice specs in Celestic Town, oh my god, it's fucking magical. Here's another comparison for you. Imagine your Alakazam had 3 immunities and the option to learn Thunderbolt and Dark Pulse. If anything, I suppose you could argue for Alakazam to move up this tier list a little bit. I just think it's a bit more risky to use without all those immunities and extra coverage options. Let me know what you guys think. Now, these next 4 do not exist in Platinum, unfortunately, but I will go over them anyway for anyone wondering how they would perform in Diamond and Pearl. Mismagius is really cool. I love the theme, I love the way the stats are spread, and this is yet another Pokemon with 3 immunities. It gets all of the same stuff as Gengar pretty much, it just doesn't hit as hard. And that's really all it is when you think about it. A budget Gengar? Definitely not a bad thing though. This is still going into the A tier easily. Mischievous is actually not even that bad either. You won't be able to use either of them against Mars or Jupiter unfortunately, as they both have dark type coverage, but you'll find great success against Maylene, Wake, and beyond. We've got Honchkrow up next, and I really like it. Dark types have few but very important niches in Sinnoh, especially in dealing with Lucian of the Elite Four, and Honchkrow will perform very well in that fight. You get Nasty Plot for some sweet setup if you want that. It's a mixed attacker, so you can mix and match stuff like Night Slash, Sucker Punch, Psychic, and Shadow Ball. It is annoying that you can't get Sucker Punch without leveling your Murkrow until level 45, but I actually think that might be worth it. That move alone will put in so much work against Lucian and his Psychic types. Both of its abilities are decent as well. Definitely deserves the low end of A tier. You could think of Purugly as kind of a better Delcatty in a way. It's got very similar tools such as Charm, Assist, and Attract, and while I did say that it's better than Delcatty, it's still not that good. Your level up moveset isn't super great. It is worth noting that you can get Sucker Punch if you delay Glameow's evolution until 41. The fact that this thing evolves at level 38 is just ridiculous. Glameow is basically unusable, so you can't even think about using it until after Fantina, I think, which is gym number 5 by the way in Diamond and Pearl. It does get Fake Out at least, and it's fast, so it's definitely still usable. It just could have been so much better with a few slight changes. Now, Skuntank on the other hand is very solid. I'll stick it right above Roserade. It can't go into the A tier specifically because of Stunky. It just doesn't get anything early on. Like, you'll be using Scratch or Fury Swipes until level 25, and then you don't even get Skuntank until 34, which would put it past the halfway point of the game. But once you do get it, there's a lot to like. Night Slash is great stab, it even gets Flamethrower upon evolving, and its special attack stat is usable enough for it. Bulky without sacrificing too much speed, and a much better typing overall compared to Perugly. It's great against Fantina and Lucian, and otherwise fares neutrally against the rest of the region. You don't really ever have to box it for any reason. Seaking is just so underwhelming. It's one of the worst water types you could really go for. Does anyone actually like Seaking? It doesn't get anything special outside of your typical Surf/Waterfall and Ice Beam combo, and who cares? It sucks that Megahorn doesn't come until after the Pokemon League's level cap, because that would help it at least a little bit, and make it more interesting. Overall, this is just a worse Golduck. If it's the last water type that you have, then maybe you consider adding it to your squad. It really pains me to do this because I really like Whiscash, but I gotta put it in C tier. The very high end of C. But still, I can't describe it any other way than just average. It's worse than Gastrodon and Quagsire in almost every single way, and they nerfed its Learn set for Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald for some reason. You used to get Earthquake at level 36 if I'm not mistaken, and now in Platinum, it gets pushed back 9 whole levels at 45. I guess that's not the biggest deal, as I think the soonest you can catch Barboach is around that level cap anyway. Not 100% positive on that though. My fishing knowledge is a little rusty for Sinnoh. Otherwise, as far as I can tell, Whiscash doesn't get anything new in Sinnoh that's worth talking about, which is a shame. I'm going to stick Chimecho right next to Haunter. It sacrifices some damage and speed to be a lot more bulky, but this is kind of just a budget Kadabra of sorts, I suppose. The line does get Yawn, and it is a screen user, so those are always nice utility options to have. You can use this for Gardenia, maybe Maylene as well, and then otherwise it will be fairly neutral across the rest of the game. Just has lesser stats than a lot of the other psychic types. Medicham is really cool, and it gets some much needed help in Gen 4 with the physical special split. All of the elemental punches are now available to you as physical attacks, and with that you can now really take advantage of pure power, which you were not able to do as well back in Gen 3. You will have to wait until level 37 to unlock this line's true potential, but that does come in just in time for Crasher Wake and the move tutor that teaches you the previously mentioned punches, so it kind of works out. I don't know if I can put it in A. It's definitely better than Machoke, but I don't think I can put it super close to Machamp either at the same time. I think the top end of B is fine. Its newly found coverage allows it to succeed against almost anything, but Medicham is still pretty frail. Now, it doesn't matter whether you get Levitate or Heat Proof as an ability, Bronzong is still an easy A tier for me. I always try to advocate at least having one tank on the team, and I personally define that role to be more than just being really bulky. I think you need to have a good enough toolset and typing to be able to handle any given situation. When things are not going the way that you expected and you just need to deal with a single threat that's really giving you a lot of problems, Bronzong is like the perfect Pokemon to step in and save your ass. The Psychic and Steel combo ensures that you resist pretty much almost everything on top of Bronzong's bulk. And you also have a very serviceable attacking stat as well if you want to be more than just a screen-setting Toxic Staller. While I don't think it checks any one matchup specifically, it's just generally good to have with you regardless of where you're at in your playthrough. I won't go into Rapidash too much as I have already made an entire video on its performance in Gen 4. Go check out that video later, by the way, if you want a full breakdown. And while I mostly stand by my feelings towards it from that video, I will move it slightly down the list as a solid B instead of a B+. Long story short, I believe Ponyta and Rapidash fulfill a niche that is very difficult to replace in the Generation 4 games, and that is being a fast fire type. Ponyta will do well against Gardenia obviously, and then the general early game as a whole, as the stats are very good for that portion of the game. And once you get Rapidash, you'll be able to check both Candace's Frostlass and Cyrus's Weavile as well, which can be very difficult to manage otherwise. The physical special split obviously helped Rapidash out a lot, and yeah, I just like this line in Sinnoh specifically. Sudowoodo is really good when you get it at level 20 in Gold, Silver, and Crystal, but not so much in Platinum when you get it much later in the game at level 30. I really shouldn't make it sound like it's bad, because it certainly isn't. It just sucks that you get it at that point in the game where rock types will just start to become a little less useful. I think I'll stick it right next to Whiscash. It's just a worse Graveler / Golem, but it does get some pretty cool stuff like Wood Hammer and Sucker Punch. Certainly still very usable against threats like some of Candace and Cyrus's Pokemon. I still don't know how this thing became a Pokemon, but Mr. Mime is still pretty good. It's just boring, I guess. Honestly, most Mono-Psychic Pokemon are pretty boring, though. This guy is literally just a bridge between Kadabra and Alakazam. It has like the same stat spread and learns pretty much all of the same moves. It's solid, I just hate looking at it. Blissey can go straight into S, although I'm not exactly sure where I would rank it within the tier itself. It's just one of those Pokemon that breaks the way the game is intended to be played, and I typically ban it from my runs. It's an unstoppable special wall. Just use it against anything that only uses special type attacks, and you basically win. It can obviously heal itself as well. It's just busted. Clefable is just solid. Decent stats, it gets literally any move it wants, and you just have a lot of options at your disposal here. Your standard normal type, but with an actually usable stat spread. And Chatot is so whatever. Chatter is a very funny move, but I mean, this thing doesn't do anything otherwise that another flying type couldn't do better. You also won't get Chatot until after Gardenia and Maylene, so there really isn't anything it'll match up well against after that point. It's not F tier, but I personally wouldn't want to use this for anything. Moving on to our beloved mascot, Raichu is great. Good electric types are really hard to come by in Sinnoh, and I think Raichu is one of them. The physical special split helps it utilize its mixed attacking spread with moves like Brick Break and Dig at your disposal. And as far as the matchups go, you get Raichu just in time for Crash or Wake. It'll also be great against all the flying type users like your rival and Cyrus, and it's even nice to have against a few of Cynthia's Pokemon as well. Definitely worthy of A tier. Now, I'm gonna put Noctowl in C, I think. It's not bad though. It gets a lot of help from the physical special split as well, with some actual flying type options to go with on the special side. It also gets Reflect super early, which greatly helps its weakness on the physical side. And you'll have access to stuff like Shadow Ball, Psychic, and Roost. It's really well designed, it just doesn't have that oomph that you get from some of the other flying types. Now, even though I've never used Spiritomb in a Nuzlocke before, I feel pretty comfortable putting it in the A tier. As much as I love me some Sableye, this Pokemon is exactly what we all wish Sableye could have been, mechanically speaking. Zero weaknesses, massive bulk, and oh yeah, it can hit pretty hard as well. It has Sucker Punch for some reason, which is awesome, but I don't understand where the fist comes from. You have Nasty Plot as well, which is an incredible setup option. I feel very similarly about Spiritomb as I do Crobat in a sense, because it's just generally great everywhere but doesn't necessarily counter anything specific. Next up is Garchomp, and this one is another easy one for me to rank. I'll put it right up here. I would probably rank it the highest if you didn't get it so late, but it still just has to be in the S tier. The only complaint I have is that it doesn't get Earthquake via level up, so you will have to use your TM, but I mean, come on. If you're gonna use it on something, this is it. And yeah, this thing will annihilate the rest of the game once it does completely evolve. An absolute monster. Okay, another S tier incoming. Snorlax is another potentially ban-worthy Pokemon in my opinion. Another massive special wall, and even though it's less tanky than Blissey and doesn't come with any self-healing, Snorlax more than makes up for that with early Belly Drum, Yawn, and a bunch of powerful options on the physical side. I guess I'll still put it right underneath Blissey, simply for the fact that actually obtaining a Snorlax in a playthrough is really difficult and very unlikely, whereas your chances of getting a Blissey are actually pretty high. And going from one of the best to probably the worst you can possibly do, Unknown obviously just doesn't have anything to it. It's garbage, don't use it. And back to the top we go! Another easy S for me. Lucario is, in my opinion, the greatest mixed attacker the world of Pokemon has ever seen. I'm imagining in my mind this fun game you could play, which is to write down every single attacking move in existence on little pieces of paper and stick them into a hat, and then see how many pieces of paper you would need to pull out before you found a move that Lucario couldn't learn. Seriously, the sky is the limit. You get Aura Sphere, of course, you also get Swords Dance, as if a Pokemon like Lucario would ever need something like that. This is a fantastic Pokemon for your Nuzlocke. Oh, and it's guaranteed. Definitely can't forget that. Quagsire is going into the B tier, right in between Gastrodon and Whiscash. Even though I love the water ground combo personally, having 3 of them in the same game seems like a little much. I don't know. Quagsire gets a pretty nice edge over Whiscash for a few reasons. 1, it gets Earthquake earlier at level 36. 2, it can get Water Absorb as an ability, which is awesome. And 3, it has a physical ice type option in Ice Punch. Oh, and it gets Yawn as well. So yeah, a bit better for sure. Very solid Pokemon. Pelipper is up next, and this might be a hot take, but I'm actually giving it the A tier nod in Sinnoh. Water Flying is such a good type combination in general, and even though electric type attacks are a bit more common in this region, most of those attacks are in the form of Spark or something like Thunderfang. In other words, physical and slightly weaker, which Pelipper can actually take most of the time if needed. It gets Roost via level up, so you can use your TM on something else. It gets the Stockpile package as well, which ain't too bad, and it's a great user of Surf and Ice Beam. Certainly better than the water types listed below in my opinion. And I don't know what it is about it, but Pelipper just seems to excel throughout the overworld in particular. It can get you out of a lot of messes you weren't trying to put yourself in against those sneakily strong random trainers. I like it. Moving on to Girafarig, and I'm going to place him right next to Mr. Mime. The only important thing to note about Girafarig that separates it from the other psychic types is that it gains an immunity to Ghost because of its normal typing, which admittedly is pretty interesting. It does get Baton Pass, but unfortunately your only target for it will be Agility because I believe Calm Mind is locked behind the post game in Platinum. So I guess from that perspective, it's actually quite a bit better in Emerald, but it still gets the job done here as well. Hippowdon is pretty solid as well. It's kind of similar to Luxray in that it's another physical attacker with access to all of the elemental fangs and crunch. But unlike Luxray, Hippowdon is tankier, gets Stab Earthquake, and even has Yawn as well for some utility. The 2 biggest downsides to Hippowdon are obviously his speed, it will pretty much never move first, and its ability in Sandstream. While Game Freak did add a little bit more to the Sandstorm strategies in Gen 4, it still wouldn't reach its full potential until Unova, and Sandstorm can just kind of get in the way of what you're trying to do sometimes. You just don't want to deal with that on top of whatever your enemy is doing. Moving on to Azumarill, I definitely put it way too high on my Emerald list, and even though it gets a lot of well-needed help from the physical special split, I no longer think this is an A-tier Pokemon. I am going to stick it right in the middle of B though. If you get huge power, this becomes a high B tier, I think, maybe even borderline A. You get Waterfall and Aqua Tail, and then stuff like Ice Punch and Brick Break as well for coverage. If you do not get huge power, then Azumarill becomes a C tier Pokemon. Still usable, but just so much more average with Thick Fat. You can still get pretty good success against Byron, Bertha, Flint, etc. Damn, there's a lot of really solid Pokemon in Platinum. That B tier is filling up quick. Honestly, I think I want to put Drapion into S. It is literally good at everything. It's fast, bulky, hits pretty hard, has an unbelievably good type combination defensively, and it gets battle armor on top of all that. That's actually so insane. The only downside is you won't get it until level 40, and Skorupi is pretty useless, I'd say, especially around the time of the game in which you can first obtain one. But, I mean, come on. You get every bite move known to man, you have access to Aqua Tail and Aerial Ace, and then just throw Earthquake on it and be happy. It's just gonna do everything for you. Like, yeah, you gotta watch out for those ground type attacks yourself, but your physical bulk is already so high and you can't get crit. And even if you get Sniper as an ability instead, it's still good. It just means every time you crit, you delete your opponent. Yeah, that's alright. I'll take that, thank you. Toxicroak is really good, but also really, really frail. I still want to put it on the lower end of A tier though, because it can get dry skin, which would make it immune to water, which is sick, and it has a very nice moveset as well. Sucker Punch, a couple of the elemental punches, Poison Jab, X Scissor, Earthquake, Brick Break, and more. It's also faster than you think, it hits really hard, you just gotta be careful when using this thing. Any psychic move, like regardless of what Pokemon uses it or what move it is, will pretty much guarantee your demise. I do like it though, and it's pretty common to run into as well. Carnivine is not good. This is just a worst Cacturne, and Cacturne is already not good. This also has to be the worst stockpile user ever created. It has to be. It doesn't get any coverage outside of Crunch and Sludge Bomb, and like, what are you going to use this against? I guess you could use it against Wake's Quagsire to decent effect, and maybe some of Byron's Pokemon? Maybe? That's probably it though. If you get this as your Great Marsh encounter, you're gonna be pretty upset about it. Stat-wise, you can honestly say that Octillery is kind of like a water version of Carnivine. Except, water is a much better typing, it gets way better moves, and it doesn't take up an important encounter location either. It's going into C tier because it is very slow and very weak defensively, which usually never adds up to a good Pokemon, but it can have its moments. There are just plenty of other water types to choose from, so Octillery will always have to be a bench warmer until something horrible happens to your team. Up next we have Lumineon, which might be one of the most forgettable Pokemon from this generation. It's so boring. You won't get it until pretty late if I'm not mistaken, and it doesn't do anything interesting to separate it from the other mono water types. It gets U-turn, which is cool, until you realize that the TM for U-turn can be obtained as many times as you want from the game corner. And then you have Bounce, I guess, which isn't really putting it over the top or anything. Hey, Lumineon gets Storm Drain though, except unfortunately that ability is completely unusable in its Gen 4 state. The ability won't prevent the incoming water damage, and it won't boost your special attack either. It's literally just a taunt for water moves. Our fishy friend is still a water type, I guess, and water types are always really good to have, but it's pretty much on the same level as Octillery. You can use it if you absolutely have to. I just wouldn't if you can help it. Tentacruel is an excellent Pokemon, but I do not think it quite makes it to the S tier. It's fast and bulky, and that is exactly what you want in your water type. It just doesn't hit that hard. Tentacruel is great against Bertha and Flint and whatnot, but you will need some additional help on the special attack side, whether that is EV training or utilizing choice specs to give yourself the damage you're missing out on. Without that extra damage source, it can be frustrating to use sometimes, so I'm okay with putting it here on the list. Don't misunderstand though, it's still really good, and it's guaranteed in every run, and you can pretty much bring it with you to any fight and it'll match up well against at least one thing. Milotic though is an easy S for me, as painful and annoying as it is to obtain. You could argue that it's maybe slightly weaker in this generation because of the physical special split, I suppose? But I mean, the stats are still huge, Marvel Scale is still an insane ability, and you can still get access to self-healing and recover, and even some utility options in Captivate and Attract. And then just slap Surf and Ice Beam on it, and you've got a very difficult Pokemon for your opponents to handle. Milotic won't come until around badge number 7, but it will perform very well against basically every fight moving forward outside of Volkner. Mantine is really cool, and you know what? That C tier placement for Octillery makes even more sense now, because honestly, your Remoraid encounter is probably more useful going towards getting a Mantine than it is actually using an Octillery. Oh man, I think it goes right next to Pelipper, as basically the same thing, just with big special defense instead of physical defense. The other thing that separates it from Pelipper is its move pool diversity on both the physical and the special side. Not that you'd want to teach your Mantine any physical moves anyway, but I do find it interesting that it can learn so many of them. The primary gimmick here are the beam moves, like Psybeam and Signal Beam, for example, so there are some options there. The only big downside is how late you can get one, because you won't have Mantine until you're right outside of Victory Road, so that sucks a little bit, but you can definitely use it against the League for sure with decent success. You know what, I'll move it into a high B actually, just for that reason alone. You don't have it for very long, so it won't get a chance to shine against the rest of the region. Alright, now for everyone's favorite Christmas tree / Yeti hybrid. The best word for me to describe Abomasnow would have to be awkward. It's fairly slow with middle of the road defensive stats and a poor type combination as well. Causing infinite hail with snow warning every single time it switches in can also be annoying to deal with, because chances are the rest of your team isn't just filled in with a bunch of ice types. But you know, on the flip side, Abomasnow has a great offensive toolkit. Being a mixed attacker lets us use moves like Giga Drain, Ice Beam, and then stuff like Wood Hammer and Earthquake on the physical side. I guess Wood Hammer does kinda add to the awkward feeling I mentioned. Like, you're already putting yourself in danger simply because of the Grass-Ice combo, but now you have to worry about recoil damage as well. Where am I going with this? I guess I'll put him right next to Golduck. Golduck is in the middle because it doesn't do anything great or bad, while Abomasnow is there because I feel like it's either really good or really bad, depending on the situation. Weavile is another one that I feel like just misses out on the S tier placement. It does have a very bad defensive typing overall, but that usually doesn't matter all that much when you're one of the fastest Pokemon in existence and you hit like a frickin' train. The only real downside I see keeping it out of S tier are Weavile's move pool options. Night Slash and Ice Punch are good, and you will find great success with both moves. It's just not the premier attacking moves like Ice Beam, Flamethrower, Thunderbolt, and Psychic. It also just gets a lot of moves via level up that just feel a little out of place. Like Nasty Plot makes a lot of sense thematically, I guess, so I can't fault Game Freak there, but it's not exactly a move that Weavile can utilize well. With all of that being said, Weavile will be great against Cyrus, it will absolutely decimate Lucian's team, and it's a fantastic counter for Cynthia's Garchomp as well. Overall, a well-deserved evolution for Sneasel. Rotom is pretty great, even though you don't get access to its other forms. I think I've already mentioned it before, but fast electric types are fairly scarce in Platinum, and they are really helpful. And this one comes with an immunity to Electric's only weakness because it has Levitate, which is a really awesome niche to have. Rotom definitely has weaker stats overall, and is pretty squishy, so I can't put it above Raichu or even Luxray for that matter, but the additional ghost typing does give it a total of 3 immunities, which is very helpful. And you'll obtain your Rotom right after badge number 2, so you'll have it for most of the playthrough, which is awesome. Helpful against Maylene, Crasher Wake, Cyrus, and then of course any of the flying/water types that you'll encounter in the league as well. Gliscor can hang out right next to Lucario in S. A little better even. Like Lucario, Gliscor is seemingly capable of learning every single physical attack in existence. So be prepared to get creative with it. Fast, strong, bulky, really good typing, can't lose any of its attacking power at all if you have Hyper Cutter as ability. It's amazing. Just be on the lookout for your opponent's ice coverage because you really don't want to lose this thing. You can encounter Gligar literally just in time for Earthquake as well, which is convenient. The Razor Fang can also be found soon after you reach Veilstone City, which I'm pretty sure means you'll have this thing for Maylene and her Lucario if I'm not mistaken. And then Gliscor will generally be great against the region as a whole from there. Probopass is a very silly Pokemon, visually and mechanically. It's just a pile of defensive stats. It has 2 4x weaknesses, which always really sucks, but at the same time, if you're really up against anything other than fighting or ground, you're gonna have a pretty good shot of coming away with the win. It also really sucks that it doesn't get Earth Power until level 79. It's just another silly thing about it. But you will have Power Gem and Thunderbolt at least, which are nice, and Flash Cannon as well against other rock types. It's very solid. If it didn't have 2 4x weaknesses and it wasn't the slowest Pokemon in existence, I would probably put it in A. Next, we have a pair of Ralts evolutions in Gardevoir and Gallade. Both Pokemon are great, but Gallade definitely has a substantial edge for sure. Gardevoir is basically just a slower Alakazam, but slightly bulkier on the defensive side. There's really nothing else to say about it other than that. Gallade, though, is going into S for sure. It's so powerful. I used Psycho Cut, Close Combat, Leaf Blade, and Earthquake if I'm not mistaken for the walkthrough, and it was ridiculous. You can pretty much have that exact moveset minus Close Combat, like right as you obtain Gallade. Just swap in Break until you hit level 53 and you're good. But yeah, with a moveset like that, you can bring Gallade to almost any fight. The only major fight I would avoid is Cyrus, just because it doesn't stack up well against his Distortion World team. But other than that, you can go pretty crazy against pretty much anything else. Licky Licky! I got to use this for not even an entire episode in my walkthrough series before it died. I think I spent enough time with it though to be able to say that I think Licky Licky is pretty solid. It's definitely better than Clefable and Lopunny, for example, because it does very similar things, but it is just insanely bulky on top of all that. The normal typing complements the bulkiness as well, and just like the other regular old normal types, it gets like every TM in the game. And that's exactly what Licky Licky is. A bulky normal type that just randomly shoots out lightning and flames. And now we move on to all the evolutions that you can get in Sinnoh. I'm going to try to go through each one pretty quickly because I do feel like most of them are fairly self-explanatory, but I do want to make sure I point out anything interesting as I do so. Vaporeon is going to chill right next to Empoleon. If someone walked up to me and asked me to describe what a bulky water type is, I would tell them to evolve their Eevee into a Vaporeon in their next playthrough and tell them to let me know how that works out for them. Great Pokemon, can't go wrong. I went back and forth on this a little bit, but I do think Jolteon should go into the lower end of S tier. Fast electric types are so useful and so hard to come by, as I mentioned earlier in the video, and Jolteon simply fills that niche the best in Platinum. And oh yeah, it has Volt Absorb. Can't forget about that. I'm going to stick Flareon right next to Rapidash, as they are very similar. The physical special split does help Flareon out a little bit, as it does Rapidash as well, but it can really only learn stuff like Bite and Fire Fang as far as physical attacks go. It's also fairly slow too, which makes it trickier to use against Candace and Cyrus when compared to the faster fire types. Flareon is still solid though. Fire types are important, and its special attack is plenty good enough to use Flamethrower as well. Espeon is literally just the sexy furry bait version of Alakazam and Gardevoir, so it goes here. Umbreon is pretty much the same beefy toxic staller that you know and love, but it unfortunately doesn't get Moonlight before the league's level cap, so that really sucks, and that definitely bumps it down for me a bit. It's honestly not that much different than Bastiodon. And now we've got Gen 4's newest additions in Leafeon and Glaceon. Eevee's grass version is unfortunately the worst of the bunch, I'd say. Game Freak did Leafeon so dirty in these games. They locked its only usable physical stab option in Leaf Blade behind level 71 and Swords Dance at 78. If Leafeon had both of those options before the Pokemon League, it would actually be kinda sick. It pains me to do it, but I gotta put Leafeon in C. Glaceon isn't that much better being an ice type, but it does get better options for the way its stats are spread out. Stab Ice Beam is still gonna cause a lot of damage. It also gets Mirror Coat as well, which is honestly a little intriguing to me. I'd rank it right under Flareon. Moving away from the EVs, we've got Altaria, and I've always thought this was kind of a middle-of-the-road Pokemon. If it didn't get Dragon Dance, I would probably put it in C, honestly. It's built like a tank, but doesn't really get any moves that support that kind of build. It's just a tanky Pokemon with weak offenses that knows nearly nothing other than offensive moves. It's like, what are you supposed to do with that? Unless you want to take your chances with Sing, Mist is the only other move that could be helpful, but it's still just super niche. Anyway, this thing still gets Dragon Dance, so I can't put it any lower than B. Togekiss is bulky, free, learns Aura Sphere, and is therefore an S tier Pokemon. I'm gonna put it just past Milotic because it is literally a guaranteed encounter in every single run of Platinum. Totally deserves to be regarded as one of the best flyers in the game. You got that Aura Sphere, you get Stab Extreme Speed, Flamethrower, Psychic, Shadow Ball, and a lot more. Lots of options to play around with. Serene Grace is also one of the best abilities in the game and very fun to play with. I don't believe you'll get your first Shiny Stone until Iron Island, so you will have Togetic for the first 5 badges, but Togetic can still hold its own fairly well until then. You just won't use it for anything other than utility. Once you have Togekiss, you can pretty much take it with you anywhere outside of Candace's gym maybe. It can still do some damage even in there, but I just wouldn't even bother risking it. And we've got another back-to-back S-tier placement with Houndoom. This Pokemon is so sick. I actually can't believe you get this at level 24. Houndoom's type combination of Dark and Fire is really what puts it this high on the list. As I've already mentioned a few times throughout the video, both Dark and Fire type Pokemon hold very important niches in Platinum that just make things a lot easier for you as the player. So imagine combining both of those together into one Pokemon that is also fast and hits hard from both the physical and special sides. Houndoom is so good, and I'm very happy they included it so early in the run. You should be able to grab it right before Maylene and Gym number 4 as well. Just to reiterate why Dark and Fire types are great, Houndoom will dominate Byron, Candace, Cyrus's Weavile, and both Aaron and Lucian of the Elite Four. 3 of those fights are run killers, in my opinion. And we're going to keep this top tier train rolling with Magneton and Magnezone. Magneton is a high A for me this time around, and the only reason I don't want to put it into S is due to the physical special split. Special based ground and fighting type moves exist now, and that's terrifying to think about, as any one of them will ruin your Magneton. Still, an insanely good Pokemon, and it's no longer even fully evolved. If Magneton is flirting with an S-tier placement, then you all know where Magnezone is going. It's literally just Magneton, but with more special defense and HP to take whatever few attacks it can't actually resist. Whenever you get the chance, go take a look at the type defenses chart for Magnezone. It's just silly. It gets Flash Cannon as well for some usable Steel type stab to deal with any rock ground types if necessary. This is the kind of Pokemon that can carry entire teams if needed. Tangrowth is great if you can get Tangela as your Great Marsh encounter. It evolves at level 33 as long as you teach your Tangela Ancient Power, which is literally immediately after you get it. So that also means it comes just in time for Crash or Wake as well. And Tangrowth is a beast. Huge pile of stats, and the thing that I like about it the most is it gets a lot of move pool options that are never historically been available for grass types. Ancient Power is obviously a pretty good example, but you can also get Focus Blast, Earthquake, and Rock Slide too. It's not better than Torterra obviously, but I think it's still maybe an A tier Pokemon? Maybe not, just because it's mono grass. I do think it helps a lot that its bulk is on the physical side, unlike Roserade, which is why I'm giving Tangrowth the edge here. If it had a second typing to help it out more, I think it would be an easy A tier Pokemon. Yanmega is another Pokemon I felt got done dirty in Gen 4. I get the Bug Flying combo makes sense, but I think it could have been Bug Dragon instead. And that would have been so freaking cool. And it would have made it a lot more usable as well. Because not only is Bug Flying so boring to me, it is one of the worst type combinations in general. But you know what? I'll give Team Bug some love and put it in the A tier. It still has a really nice spread, being both fast and powerful, and it will get Bug Buzz before the Pokemon League level cap, and some decent coverage options as well. And you get Speed Boost as an ability, which is pretty broken. Now, you know what? I actually can't put it above Tangrowth. Bug Flying is just that bad against the rest of Sinnoh, especially starting at gym number 5. Yeah, damn, you really have a rough time matching up against anything that won't have a rock or flying type attack especially. There's just too much that kills you. It's a shame. Oh, and speaking of bad typings, we've got Tropius. And while I will admit I was wrong about it initially for Pokemon Emerald, it actually really grew on me a lot, grass types are again really bad in Sinnoh overall. It still doesn't get Leech Seed in its Learn set for some insane reason, it's still a goddamn egg move, and yeah, the only new things Tropius gets are Air Slash and Silver Wind, which is not going to be enough to bring this thing out of D tier this time. Sorry Tropius, I really want you to be good, but it's just not worth using you in Sinnoh. Let's talk about some more of the new trait evolutions. Rhydon can go right next to Graveler because they are basically the same Pokemon for the most part. Yes, I know Rhydon's stats are far more comparable to Golem's, but the two biggest things holding this line back are the fact that 1, you won't get Rhydon until badge number 4, whereas with Geodude you have it from the beginning of the game, and 2, you won't get Rhydon until level 42, and Rhyhorn is pretty awful. It has a similar stat spread to Graveler, but it doesn't learn any rock moves outside of Rock Blast, and it doesn't get any ground moves at all until it evolves. So that's why it's going here. It's still solid though, especially useful against Cyrus and Volkner later on. Rhyperior is definitely a bit more interesting, although I have not actually used one before the postgame. Solid Rock seems like a really useful ability to have for a Pokemon like Rhyperior, because Ground Rock is a type combo that is obviously very vulnerable. And the stats are just so huge on the physical side, if you can match up against something that can't hit you for super effective special damage, I just don't see how you lose. It's probably just a little bit better than Golem, I'd say, although it's close. Next up, we've got some more Ghosties. Dusclops is still very solid as it was in Gen 3, it still has all the same tools it had before for Toxic Stalling, and now it has even more options. There are definitely a lot of moves to mix and match. And like most other ghost types in this game, Dusclops doesn't hard counter anything necessarily. It's just nice to have a tank that can also provide good utility when it's needed. I'll stick him right next to Probopass. And Dusknoir is just Dusclops, but with more firepower from the offensive side. So you can actually build it more like a Bronzong, for example, which is where I'm actually going to place him actually. It's a big tank that can also dish out some good damage if you want that. This line gets access to the elemental punches now, which is really nice, as well as Sucker Punch from the move tutor. And now we've got the only line I think in existence that has 2 trait evolutions, with the Porygon line, which is why we are also ranking Porygon as well. Porygon is just fine. It's like using a Clefable almost, but with worse stats. You do get Recover via level up though, which you should always get bonus points for, but Porygon is also pretty frail, so it won't get as much use out of it compared to its evolutions. Now, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z are very interesting. Porygon 2 will get the most benefit out of that Recover because it is the tankiest version of this line. It sees a very considerable upgrade in stats, if you will. Download is a pretty decent ability, you're never going to complain about free attacking power, and yeah, overall very solid. I'd say it's just a little bit better than Licky Licky as a special normal type user because it has more firepower, and it obviously gets Recovered. Porygon Z, on the other hand, is the more offensive version of the line, and it's actually pretty insane. It comes with the ability Adaptability, which increases the damage of your stab attacks by an additional 50%, basically making all stab moves deal double damage instead. 160 base power tri-attacks and 300 base power hyper beams with a massive 135 base special attack stat? That sounds pretty incredible. It's also easily the fastest member of this line as well, but it is also the weaker one defensively. It's almost a perfect glass cannon though. A normal type should not be allowed to have that much special attack when it can learn basically every single special move that has ever been created. I think I'm going to put it in S honestly because of that. It's just so strong. Scyther will go right next to Yanmega as they are both great, but suffer the same brutal reality of having one of the worst type combinations ever. And Scizor will get dropped into S. Scyther is still very useful, especially against Maylene, and although your move pool options for Technician are very limited, 135 base power wing attacks are still pretty freaking sweet. You still get access to great coverage options too, like Night Slash and Brick Break, which will be helpful for some of the later fights. Scizor has the much better typing, bulkier stat spread, and also gets Stab Bullet Punch to pair with Technician as well. It also gets Swords Dance just in time for the league cap too, and because of its fantastic defensive typing, it will be able to utilize it much better than Scyther would. Yeah, this Pokemon is just great. Bring it with you everywhere, just be cognizant of fire type attacks. We've got even more trait evolutions in Electabuzz and Electivire. I am very happy that you can actually use all of these Pokemon in Platinum, and you don't have to actually wait to the post-game. And as you can see by how the list has been going so far, it really gives you a ton of very good Pokemon to work with. Electabuzz is very solid. I'm going to put it right next to Girafarig. It's definitely better than some of these other Pokemon here. The only issue is you get it so late, like right before the 8th gym, so you really only have this for the league. Still though, an electric type is decent to have for the league and Victory Road too, honestly, and it is a screen user, so you do have that option as well. Electivire is just a much better Electabuzz. I wish there was more to add there, but it's really that simple. It has access to all the elemental punches, it's a bit bulkier, it's just great. I'll give Raichu a slight edge just because you do get it so much sooner. Like, you can at least use Raichu against Wake and Cyrus and stuff like that, whereas Electivire is again only usable for the Pokemon League. Magmar and Magmortar. This is a similar deal, but they are a little bit better for sure because you do get them way sooner, and while electric types are nice to have, I still think fire fills a much more important role in the grand scheme of things. Magmar can sit next to Rapidash because they're pretty much fulfilling the same purpose. You do get Ponyta a lot sooner, but Magmar has the better moveset and is able to use it better. And then Magmortar is a pretty high A with all of those extra stats. It's also definitely worth mentioning that Magmortar can learn Thunderbolt, which Magmar cannot. So that is a massive upgrade for sure. And again, fire types are very important to overcome some of the more difficult late game obstacles like Candace, Cyrus, Lucian's Bronzong, Cynthia's Lucario, and Roserade, etc. Mamoswine is probably the best ice type in the Sinnoh decks. The ground ice combo is just so good offensively. It gets Ice Shard from Swinub to make up for its lackluster speed stat. You obviously get Earthquake via level up. Between those two moves alone, you can hit over half of the types in the game for super effective damage, including Cynthia's Garchomp. There isn't anywhere near as much water to worry about in Sinnoh, and so you're really only concerned with fire mostly. Grass types won't be as common in the later stages of the game either. Super good Pokemon, pretty easy to catch as well. You have like 4 or 5 tries, I think. So yeah, definitely worthy of S tier. Moving on to some other Frosties, Glalie is not super great, but still usable because it does get access to Ice Shard, Crunch, and Shadow Ball, which are nice. I am surprised that it doesn't even explode anymore via level up. I felt like that was kind of its thing. Frostlass, on the other hand, is certainly a lot better. It is still fairly frail, and it doesn't hit super hard either out of the box. You will have to invest some EVs into it if you really want to see the benefits. But Ice and Ghost are great offensive types, and having Stab for both Shadow Ball and Ice Beam on a very fast Pokemon is really good. I'll put it right next to Alakazam. The end of the tier list is finally here. And what better way to close things out than with the disaster Pokemon? Absol was dealt one of the worst hands when it first came out in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, but now with the physical special split in place, it can really start to shine. It will come with Swords Dance pretty much baked into it by the time you catch one. You get Sucker Punch and Night Slash as well, Psycho Cut and Rock Slider here for some extra coverage options, and now you just gotta make sure Absol is fast enough. Speed EV investment is highly recommended, as any opposing attack that slips through will leave your Absol in a very vulnerable position. It's one of the frailest single stage Pokemon out there. But with proper planning, Absol is very rewarding to play, with dark types certainly having their place in Sinnoh. Let's stick Absol in A. And with that, this video is now over. Let me know what you think of the list in the comments below. I'm very eager to hear what you guys have to say. I spent a lot of time on this video, so if you could drop a like and make sure you're subscribed if you aren't already, I would really appreciate it. It helps a lot. That's it for me. I'll see you next time.